The relentless Arizona sun beat down, turning the dusty, unpaved roads leading into Prescott into shimmering mirages. Sarah Thompson, a woman whose 31st birthday had come and gone with the quiet dignity of an unlit candle, felt the weight of that sun, and indeed the weight of her entire life pressed down on her. She clutched a worn leather handbag to her chest, the last tangible link to a past that had dissolved around her like sugar in hot tea. Her parents, gone. Her modest inheritance, dwindled by medical bills and unfortunate investments. And her fiancé, well, he'd vanished with the last vestiges of her youth and a significant portion of her savings, leaving her with a hollow ache and a mountain of quiet shame. Now she was beholden to the Andersons, a family she barely knew, distant relatives who had offered her passage west from Ohio, a supposed fresh start. In truth, it was a practical arrangement, her capable hands for their grudging generosity. She was a silent, indispensable shadow, mending clothes, preparing meals, and tending to their two boisterous children. It was a life of quiet servitude, punctuated by Mrs. Anderson's thinly veiled criticisms about Sarah's unmarried state and advancing age. "A woman needs a husband, Sarah," Helen Anderson would cluck, her eyes sweeping over Sarah's sensible, if faded, cotton dresses, especially past 25. "Otherwise, what good are you?" Sarah would simply nod, a practiced non-committal gesture, her gaze fixed on the meticulous stitches she was placing in a torn hem. She knew her worth wasn't measured by a wedding band, but the world, especially this frontier world, seemed to disagree vehemently. The wagon train, a sprawling serpent of canvas-covered hopes and fears, snaked its way deeper into the rugged terrain. Each mile chipped away at Sarah's dwindling sense of self-worth. She listened, always listened, to the murmurs of the other women, whispers about eligible bachelors, about forming alliances, about securing a future. Sarah was never part of these conversations. She was an observer, an outsider, defined by what she lacked, not by what she possessed. Her intelligence, her resilience, her quiet strength, these were invisible currencies in a land that valued robust youth and prolific childbearing above all else. Anderson, a man whose face was as perpetually grim as the landscape, rarely addressed her directly, but his silence was a heavier judgment than his wife's words. He viewed her as an expense, a calculation of provisions consumed versus labor provided. As they approached Fort Defiance, a bustling outpost promising a brief respite before the final push to Prescott, Sarah felt a growing unease. The Andersons had been more distant than usual, their polite facade cracking under the pressure of the long journey. She knew something was amiss, a cold premonition settling in her bones. One sweltering afternoon, while gathering kindling at the edge of their encampment, Sarah heard their voices, sharp and clear through the thin canvas of the Andersons' wagon. "She's a burden, Helen, plain and simple," Mark Anderson's voice rumbled, edged with a familiar frustration. "We've fed her for 4 months, and what for? She's 31 years old. No man worth his salt wants a woman past 27, much less 31. What are we going to do with her in Prescott? She'll be useless." Helen's reply was a sigh, thick with exasperation. "I told you, Mark. Fort Defiance. We tell her there's work in the kitchens or the laundry. She can earn her keep there. It's not our responsibility to marry her off or provide for her indefinitely. We've done our part bringing her this far. It's time she fended for herself." The words struck Sarah like physical blows, each syllable a confirmation of her deepest fears. Abandonment, desperation, a life of solitary drudgery in a remote outpost, a ghost in a strange land. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging, but she swallowed them, a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth. She had to be strong. She had always been strong. But for how much longer? Days later, the dusty walls of Fort Defiance loomed into view, a stark monument to civilization in the wild expanse. The air crackled with anticipation, the relief palpable among the weary travelers. Sarah, however, felt a growing knot of dread in her stomach. The Andersons avoided her gaze, their false cheerfulness a thinly veiled mask. As the wagons rumbled to a halt within the fort's wooden palisade, a tall, imposing figure emerged from the chaotic crowd. He moved with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to command, his broad shoulders easily parting the throng. His uniform, a sturdy, practical ensemble of dark green, was subtly different from the regular soldiers, marked with the insignia of the Forest Service. This was a mountain firefighter, one of the unsung heroes who battled nature's fiercest flames in these unforgiving territories. He had been riding alongside the wagon train for the past 4 weeks, a silent guardian, his piercing grey eyes constantly scanning the horizon for smoke or trouble. His name was Brian Thorne, and he was a legend in these parts, a man of few words but formidable presence. He had watched Sarah too, though she hadn't realized it. He'd seen her quiet diligence, her tireless work, her unassuming grace, even amidst the indignity of her situation. He'd seen the way the Andersons treated her, the casual cruelty of their dismissals. He had seen a woman, not a burden. Brian approached the Andersons' wagon, his stride deliberate. Sarah was helping Mrs. Anderson unload a crate of dry goods, her back aching. "Mrs. Anderson," Brian's voice was deep, resonant, cutting through the camp's din. Helen Anderson startled, dropping a small sack of flour. "Mr. Thorne, what a surprise." Her voice was saccharine sweet, a stark contrast to her earlier vitriol. Brian's gaze, however, was fixed on Sarah, a silent question in their depths. "I understand you're planning to leave Miss Thompson here at the fort," he stated, his voice devoid of accusation, yet carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "Is that correct?" Helen stammered, her face flushing. "Well, yes, Mr. Thorne. It's just, she's looking for work, and the fort has opportunities. We've brought her all this way, you see, and we simply can't provide for her indefinitely. She's a good worker, of course, but..." She trailed off, glancing nervously at Mark Anderson, who had materialized beside her, his face a mask of discomfort. Mark cleared his throat, stepping forward. "It's for her own good, Mr. Thorne. A woman needs a purpose, and here at the fort she can find one. In the kitchens, perhaps, or with the laundry detail." Sarah stood frozen, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The humiliation was absolute, laid bare for Brian, for anyone within earshot. Her cheeks burned, but she met Brian's gaze, a flicker of defiance in her own eyes despite the shame. She would not beg. She would not break. Brian listened, his expression impassive, his eyes betraying no judgment, only a deep, unsettling stillness. When Mark finished, Brian turned his full attention to Sarah. "Miss Thompson," he began, his voice softer now yet still firm, "is this the arrangement you desire, to remain here at Fort Defiance?" Sarah swallowed hard, finding her voice. It was thin, reedy, but it was hers. I was told there was no other option, Mr. Thorne, that I was a burden." Her words, though quiet, hung in the air, a stark indictment of the Andersons' callousness. Helen gasped, but Brian raised a hand, silencing her. "There are always other options, Miss Thompson," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Always." He paused, letting his words sink in, letting the unspoken tension build. He looked at the Andersons, then back at Sarah, a decision clearly forming in his mind. The camp was growing quiet now, curious onlookers drawn to the unusual confrontation. Everyone knew Brian Thorne. Everyone respected him. To challenge him was to challenge an immovable force of nature. Sarah watched him, a strange mix of fear and a nascent hope stirring within her. What other option could there possibly be? What could this formidable, enigmatic man possibly offer her? The answer, when it came, was far more shocking and life-altering than anything she could have imagined. Brian Thorne's grey eyes, usually as cool and steady as glacier ice, momentarily flickered with an unreadable emotion. He stepped closer to the wagon, his tall frame dominating the space, casting the Andersons into shadow. He didn't look at them. His gaze remained laser-focused on Sarah Thompson. The tension in the dusty courtyard of Fort Defiance was now thick enough to cut. Every person nearby, soldiers, other travelers, even a trio of Native American traders, had stopped their activities to witness the silent drama unfolding between the imposing firefighter and the unassuming woman. "I need a wife," Brian stated, the words cutting through the dry, still air. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a decree, a simple, irrefutable fact of life in this hard country. Someone who can manage a cabin, who understands the discipline of routine, and who won't run screaming back to the city the first time a blizzard cuts off the mountain passes for 6 months. He paused, letting the harsh realities of the frontier fill the silence. The young pretty girls on the wagon train, the ones who had flirted with the idea of a mountain man's rough charm, suddenly looked pale and unsure. That life was romantic in theory, but terrifying in practice. "I need a partner, not a delicate flower," he continued, his tone practical, almost like a man discussing the specifications of a new axe. He let his eyes sweep over the crowd, a quick, dismissive appraisal, before turning back to Sarah. The Andersons, their faces a mottled mix of anger and shock, watched helplessly. Mark Anderson attempted a protest, sputtering something about propriety and legalities, but Brian ignored him completely. "And I will take the woman you were planning to abandon," Brian said, his voice hardening, each word a hammer blow against the Andersons' carefully constructed image of righteousness. He took another deliberate step, placing him less than 2 feet from Sarah. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was an almost physical pressure. His hand, large and calloused from years of gripping axes and fire hoses, lifted and pointed directly at her, past her faded dress and her tired eyes. "That," he concluded, his voice ringing with absolute certainty, "is my wife." The camp erupted. Women gasped, their hands flying to their mouths. Men murmured in a cacophony of judgment, some questioning Brian's sanity, others grudgingly admiring his directness. Helen Anderson shrieked, "You can't just claim her. She's 31 years old. She's a spinster. This isn't some savage ritual." Her words were venomous, but they only served to underscore the cruelty of her own intentions. Brian's jaw tightened, and he finally addressed the Andersons, his voice low and dangerous. "Ma'am, out here, the only savage thing is abandoning a good woman who has worked for your keep, leaving her with no provision and no recourse. I'm offering Miss Thompson a chance at a secure life, not a slow death in a fort laundry room. It seems to me that's the most decent Christian thing being offered in this entire camp." Mark Anderson tried to regain control, puffing out his chest. "See here, Thorne, we never intended to abandon her. We merely arranged an employment opportunity. She's not a piece of property. Sarah, you have a right to choose." "Indeed she does," Brian agreed, his gaze never leaving Sarah's. "The choice is hers. A kitchen job that pays little and ends with her dependent on the charity of strangers, or a hard life with me, where she will be respected and provided for." Sarah stood paralyzed, the world spinning around the silent, intense man in front of her. His words had stripped away the last remnants of her illusionary life. She saw the sheer horror in Helen Anderson's face, the desperate greed in Mark Anderson's, a greed that vanished when they realized she was not their problem anymore. The idea of Brian Thorne, the strong, silent firefighter, choosing her, the too old, unwanted spinster, was incomprehensible. Yet his logic, his brutal honesty about the alternatives, cut through the shock. What was the life waiting for her at the fort? A slow, ignoble fade into obscurity. She started, her voice barely a whisper, then cleared her throat, forcing strength into her chest. She met his powerful gaze. "I need time to comprehend this, Mr. Thorne. I need 1 week, not 4 days, but 7. Fort Defiance is a busy place. I can stay here for 1 week and think." Brian nodded, an almost imperceptible movement that surprised her. "Fair enough, Miss Thompson. 1 week. We ride out 1 week from today. You decide before the sun sets next Friday." He turned, dismissed the Andersons with a final withering glare, and strode away to tend to his horse and supplies, leaving the camp buzzing with frantic speculation. The next 7 days felt like a fever dream. Sarah remained at the fort, the Andersons having hastily packed and continued their journey to Prescott, desperate to escape the judgment of the camp. Sarah was technically free, yet she remained bound by Brian's ultimatum. She washed clothes, mended tents, and worked in the fort's small bakery, observing the lives of the women who called the fort home. They were widows, cast-offs, and women who had run out of choices, a preview of her own inevitable fate if she refused Brian. Everyone had an opinion. The young women were scandalized, calling Brian a brute and his offer an indignity. The older, tougher women, the ones who had seen real hardship, offered a different counsel. "A good man who can provide and protect is worth more than all the sweet talk in the world, Sarah," advised a wrinkled, sun-baked laundress named Martha. "And that Brian Thorne, he's pure gold in a crisis. You could do far worse." Sarah spent her evenings sitting alone on the edge of the palisade, watching the distant mountains, the rugged, beautiful, and unforgiving home Brian offered. She would see him in the camp, always busy, always efficient. She watched him interact with the soldiers, firm but fair. She saw him help a small boy retrieve a runaway dog, a flash of unexpected gentleness. He was a paradox, a wild, solitary man who possessed an undeniable foundation of honor. On the 5th night, she found him by the blacksmith's forge, inspecting the shoes on his sturdy mountain mare. The heat of the fire cast his bearded face in sharp relief, highlighting the deep lines etched by weather and worry. "Why me, Mr. Thorne?" she asked simply, walking up to him. There were younger women in the train, prettier women. Brian didn't stop his work, but his voice was slow, thoughtful. "The young ones want fine things, easy living, and a man they can manage. The mountains chew up what they can't use, Sarah. You survived the wagon train with a family who despised you, yet you worked every day. You have calluses on your hands that tell me you know how to work. You have eyes that tell me you know how to be alone. I don't need a doll to decorate a parlor. I need a shield mate, someone who knows the value of a fire when the temperature drops to zero. That kind of strength isn't about age, it's about character. And I saw yours." His words, honest and blunt, struck her with the force of revelation. He didn't see an unwanted too-old spinster. He saw a survivor. He saw her worth, not her lack. He saw a kindred spirit who understood the loneliness of being judged by a world that valued superficiality. "What would you require of me as your shield mate?" she asked, using his powerful term. "Honesty, resourcefulness, and effort," he replied, finally turning to face her, wiping his hands on a rag. "I provide the protection and the supplies. You provide the home and the partnership. We treat each other with the respect that two equals deserve. In the mountains, we rely only on the laws of nature and each other. We are a team, Sarah, a partnership forged in necessity, but held together by will. That is what I offer. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a contract for survival, a chance to build something real on the solid foundation of mutual respect, not fleeting romantic fancy. And in this brutal land, Sarah realized, that was the most beautiful love story of all. She had found a man who valued her competence over her compliance. She had found a reason to choose herself. Her 7 days were almost up, and her mind was clear. If you're enjoying this story of strength and second chances, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. We've got so many stories about overcoming injustice right here. Also, tell me this. If you were Sarah, would you rather take the offer of a hard, respectable life with Brian, or would you risk independence at the fort? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious to read your perspective. The week of deliberation vanished like water in the desert sand. Sarah Thompson felt an immense sense of clarity on the final morning, a profound peace that had been absent for years. She realized her decision hadn't been made in the fort, but long ago, in the thousands of small, arduous moments where she had chosen perseverance over despair. Brian's offer wasn't a rescue, it was a recognition. She found him by the corral, checking the cinch on his saddle, his silhouette outlined against the fierce morning sun. He looked up as she approached, his eyes guarded yet still intensely focused. He didn't press her, didn't try to sway her with sweet words or grand promises. He simply waited, affording her the respect of a true choice. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steady and ringing with a conviction she hadn't known she possessed. "I have my answer." He straightened, dropping the lead rope. "And what is your choice, Sarah?" "I choose the hard life," she stated simply, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I choose the partnership. I choose the mountains." A small, almost imperceptible muscle twitched in Brian's jaw, a tiny flicker of relief that told Sarah more than any grand declaration ever could. "Then we ride out within the hour," he replied, his voice gruff but edged with a new warmth. "We'll need the fort chaplain to make this legal and binding. No room for ambiguity or gossip, especially in the canyons." The wedding was as quick and practical as their courtship. It took place in the fort's meager chapel, a small, dusty room smelling of pine and stale tobacco. Sarah wore her best dress, the faded calico she had worn when Brian first pointed his finger at her, declaring her his. She had no flowers, no family, and no veil, but two rugged, honest-faced sergeants from the fort stood as witnesses. Brian had shaved his beard to a neat trim and donned a clean leather vest over a linen shirt, his appearance slightly less wild, more like the capable professional he was. Standing before the weary, matter-of-fact chaplain, Sarah felt a profound sense of belonging settle over her for the very first time. When the chaplain asked the critical question, "Do you, Sarah, take this man, Brian, to be your lawfully wedded husband?" her answer was loud and clear. "I will." Brian's vow was equally firm. When he finally looked at her, truly looked at her across the altar, the usual distance in his grey eyes was replaced by a quiet, deep satisfaction. The ceremonial kiss they shared was brief, a chaste seal on a practical arrangement, but as his firm, dry lips touched hers, Sarah felt the deep, bitter loneliness she had carried for over a decade finally begin to melt away. She was no longer running from a fate, she was moving toward a future. They left Fort Defiance an hour later, turning their backs on the wagon trail and the world that had cast her aside. Their journey into the high country was breathtaking and brutal. The terrain immediately became more challenging, ascending steep, rugged trails that wound through towering ponderosa pines and across ancient lava flows. Brian was an exceptional guide, moving with an effortless grace that spoke of deep intimacy with the land. He taught her to read the subtle signs, the scratch marks on the trees indicating a mountain lion, the scent of the air predicting a sudden downpour, the best ways to conserve water on the long uphill climbs. He treated her not as a fragile bride, but as an apprentice and a partner, expecting effort and focus and giving patient instruction in return. One evening, deep in the Kaibab National Forest, a cold rain began to fall. As Sarah struggled to pitch the small tent, her fingers numb, frustration welled up, threatening to spill over into tears. She felt clumsy, inadequate, and utterly defeated by the vast, indifferent wilderness. Brian, who had been unloading their pack horse, walked over. He didn't take the tent pole from her, nor did he offer pity. Instead, he simply knelt in the mud beside her. "The knots are twisting the line," he said, his voice a low rumble above the drumming rain. "You're fighting it. You have to work with the tension, not against it. Watch." He showed her a quick, complex knot, a firefighter's trick, and with 3 efficient movements, the tent frame was stable. "The mountains don't care about your feelings, Sarah. They only care about your competence. Now bank the fire with that wet wood. It will hold the coals better overnight." His lesson was hard, but it was honest. There was no room for self-pity in their marriage, only shared work. It was in that moment, shivering in the mud, that Sarah truly loved him. Not for any romantic notion, but for his absolute, unwavering reliance on her capabilities. They reached his home 4 days later, a sturdy, isolated cabin made of thick, dark logs, nestled in a high meadow beside a roaring creek fed by snowmelt. It was far smaller than she had imagined, maybe 2 rooms, but it was spotless, impeccably organized, and surrounded by a towering natural fence of ancient pines. Everything spoke of preparation and permanence. A huge, stacked pile of neatly split firewood stood ready for the long winter. A deep root cellar, already half full of preserved vegetables, was tucked into the hillside. "Home," Brian stated, dismounting. He turned to her, his gaze sweeping the clearing, then settling on her. "It's honest, Sarah, and it's ours." Over the next few weeks, Sarah threw herself into the work. She learned to preserve meat, to tend the small, surprisingly fertile garden, and to work the heavy cast-iron wood stove. She was learning to be a mountain woman, Brian's true partner. The isolation that would have once terrified her now became a source of strength, a quiet sanctuary free from the constant corrosive judgment of the outside world. Brian worked tirelessly, managing his firefighting duties and his trapping lines, but he was always present, always respectful. Their physical intimacy developed slowly, naturally, an extension of the trust and mutual dependence they had forged. Sarah realized that the gentle, deliberate man who held her close at night was the same resolute man who fought wildfires and tamed the wilderness. He was a man who valued commitment above convenience, and he had chosen her for her mettle, not her bloom. On a crisp November evening, as the first light snow began to dust the meadow, Sarah stood on the porch watching Brian check the snares near the creek. He paused, looking back toward the cabin, and saw her silhouetted in the doorway. He smiled. Not a wild grin, but a slow, genuine lift of his lips that softened his whole face. Sarah realized she was not only useful, she was treasured. She was not a burden tolerated, she was a necessity embraced. The woman everyone else had dismissed as too old, too used up, and too unwanted had been chosen by the one man whose opinion truly mattered, the man who saw her hidden, unbreakable strength. The life she had dreaded was, in fact, the one that finally made her whole. Welcome to the community. If you were moved by Sarah's journey to find her worth, we encourage you to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories of overcoming hardship and finding unexpected new beginnings. Tell us in the comments, which city or town are you watching this story from right now? We love seeing how far these tales of the frontier spirit travel. Did you like the video? And what single most important lesson did you learn from Sarah's choice and her new life with Brian? Share your reflections below.